The morning Delia Abbott received the notice that her land hearing had been scheduled for the 14th of October, 1883, she sat down at her kitchen table and did not move for a full hour, staring at the county seal pressed into the paper like a brand burned into hide. She had known this day was coming. She had known it since the afternoon 3 months prior when Silas Drummond's men had ridden onto her property and told her, with all the calm courtesy of men who believed they had already won, that the Drummond Land and Cattle Company intended to file a superior claim against the 460 acres her father had homesteaded 20 years ago in the grassland basin outside of Caldwell, Kansas. They had tipped their hats when they left. That was the part that had made her jaw tighten the most. The hat tipping, like they were doing her some kind of kindness by giving her fair warning before they swallowed her whole. Delia was 26 years old, and she had been running the Abbott place alone for 2 years, ever since her father, Thomas Abbott, had died of a fever that took him in 4 days flat in the autumn of 1881. She had no brothers. Her mother had passed when Delia was 9. What she had was 460 acres of buffalo grass and hard soil that she had poured herself into season after season, a small herd of cattle she was slowly building, a creek that ran cold even in summer, and a deed that her father had received directly from the Federal Land Office in 1863 under the Homestead Act. The problem, as Drummond's lawyer would argue, was that her father's original filing had a surveying inconsistency. 2 different government surveys, conducted 17 years apart, placed the eastern boundary of the Abbott property in 2 slightly different locations, and the parcel in dispute, roughly 80 acres of the richest grazing land in the basin, was the parcel that Drummond wanted. It was also, Delia knew, the parcel that contained the headwater spring that fed her creek. Without it, the rest of the land was considerably less viable. She had written to a land attorney in Wichita who had replied with a letter full of sympathy and a bill estimate that made her stomach drop. She had gone to the county clerk's office and asked about the process until the clerk, a tired man named Bowers who smelled of pipe tobacco, had given her a thin pamphlet and told her she needed a qualified witness who could speak to the original survey. She had spent 2 weeks writing letters to former neighbors and old friends of her father's, and received 2 replies, one from a man who had moved to Colorado and could not travel, and one from a woman who was too unwell to make the journey. The hearing was in 12 days. It was on the morning of the 2nd day, after she received the notice, that Delia rode into Caldwell to buy flour and lamp oil, and to speak with the clerk again about whether there was any way to request a postponement. She was riding her gray mare, Juniper, and she was thinking hard enough about surveyors and boundary stakes and federal land law that she very nearly did not notice the commotion outside the Caldwell Stockyard Exchange. There were at least 40 men gathered in the yard beyond the gate, the kind of gathering that meant either a major sale or a negotiation of consequence. Delia would have ridden past without a second glance, except that she recognized one of the horses tied at the post outside, a big chestnut gelding with a white blaze and 3 white stockings, an animal so distinctive that anyone who had spent time in Sumner County would have known him. That horse belonged to Dexter Hartwell. She had not spoken to Dexter Hartwell in nearly 3 years, not since a church social where they had both reached for the same dish of pickled okra at the same moment and laughed about it, and then talked for 2 hours about cattle breeding and weather patterns, and whether the railroad expansion was going to be good or terrible for small ranchers. She remembered thinking, riding home that evening, that he was one of the more genuinely interesting people she had met in the territory. She also remembered thinking that his eyes were the particular shade of brown that looked golden when the late afternoon light caught them right, and then telling herself firmly to stop thinking foolish things. Dexter Hartwell was 29 years old and ran the Hartwell Ranch on the north end of the basin, a modest but well-run operation that he had built up from the 40 acres his father had left him into nearly 220 acres of prime grazing land. He was known in Caldwell as a straight dealer, a man who kept his word to the letter, and as someone who had once ridden 30 miles through a blizzard to return a neighbor's stray calf. He was also, Delia was fairly sure, the most capable horseman in 3 counties, though she would not have said so out loud because she believed in not inflating a man's opinion of himself unnecessarily. She pulled Juniper up and watched the yard for a moment. She could see Dexter at the center of the group, standing with his hat in his hand and a sheaf of papers in the other, talking to a man she recognized as Harlan Cobb, the representative of the Southern Kansas Grazing Consortium. The consortium was the largest grazing organization in the territory, and a contract with them meant guaranteed income for 3 years at rates well above what the open market typically offered. She had heard men talk about consortium contracts the way some men talked about finding gold. They were that rare and that valuable. She did not mean to linger. She meant to ride on and attend to her business. But then she heard her own name. It was not Dexter who said it. It was the man standing beside him, a rancher named Pete Mosley who had a property 2 miles east of hers, and what Pete Mosley said, in the loud carrying voice of a man who did not modulate himself based on who might be listening, was, "I heard Drummond's going to take the Abbott place clean down to the bones. That woman doesn't have a prayer at that hearing." Delia sat very still on Juniper and breathed through her nose. She did not hear what Dexter said in response, because a wagon rolled past on the street, and the wheels on the dry board road were loud. By the time the wagon passed, the conversation in the yard had moved on, and she could only see the back of Dexter's head as he turned away. She rode on to the clerk's office and did her business, and she bought her flour and her lamp oil, and she rode home with her spine straight and her jaw set and her mind working. She would find a way. She always found a way. That was the thing about being the last Abbott left on 460 acres of Kansas grassland. You found a way or you lost everything, and losing everything was not something Delia had any intention of doing. That same afternoon, 40 miles to the north in the office of the Southern Kansas Grazing Consortium in Wellington, Dexter Hartwell sat across a broad mahogany desk from Harlan Cobb, and a man named Whitfield who was the consortium's legal secretary, and he read through the contract that would make his operation solvent for the next 3 years with a thoroughness that made Whitfield visibly impatient. The consortium contract was everything Pete Mosley had said it was. 3 years of guaranteed grazing rights on the consortium's combined open range, at a rate that would allow Dexter to expand his herd by 40%, without the financial risk that usually came with expansion, plus priority access to the consortium's shared watering infrastructure and transport agreements with the railroad. It was, Harlan Cobb had told him that morning in the stockyard, the best grazing contract the consortium had offered to an individual rancher in the territory in 5 years. They were offering it to Dexter because of his reputation, because of the quality of his breeding stock, and because the consortium wanted to build relationships with ranchers who were likely to grow. Signing it was what every sensible bone in Dexter's body told him to do. He sat in that chair and read the contract twice, and while he read it for the second time, his mind kept drifting back to that moment in the stockyard yard when Pete Mosley had said what he said about Delia Abbott. Dexter had been the one to ask, out of something he could not entirely account for, whether anyone knew the details of the Abbott land dispute. And Pete had told him, in the broad strokes that amounted to common knowledge in the county by that point, about the boundary survey inconsistency, about Drummond's claim, about the hearing date, and about the fact that Delia was going into it apparently alone and without professional representation. Dexter set the contract down on Harlan Cobb's mahogany desk. He thought about his father, who had told him once that a man's word was the only thing nobody could take from him, and that a man's conscience was the same. He thought about the Abbott place, which he had ridden past 100 times, and which anyone with eyes could see was a well-run operation that a woman had built through sheer determination after losing the parent who was supposed to be there to help her. He thought about the fact that he knew, in the particular way that one basin-dwelling rancher knew the geography that sustained everyone in the basin, that the spring on the disputed 80 acres fed not just the Abbott Creek, but the water table that several smaller properties along the south edge depended on. If Drummond took it and fenced it, the downstream effects would be felt by more than just Delia Abbott. And he thought about the surveyor, because Dexter knew something that apparently nobody in the county clerk's office had thought to mention to Delia Abbott, something he knew only because of a conversation he had had 2 summers ago with an old man named Ezra Potts who had done survey work for the Federal Land Office back in the 1860s, and who now lived in semi-retirement in a small house at the edge of Caldwell. Ezra Potts had done the original Abbott survey in 1863. Dexter knew this because Ezra had told him the story as an example of the kind of boundary disputes that happened when the federal office sent inexperienced men out to do the second survey, men who used different reference points than the original surveyor, and then recorded the discrepancy without noting it as a discrepancy. Ezra Potts was the only witness who could settle the Abbott hearing cleanly and definitively, and Delia Abbott did not know he existed. The consortium contract required a signed response within 4 business days. The Abbott hearing was in 12 days. The conflict was not one of timing but of geography and commitment. If Dexter went to find Delia Abbott and brought Ezra Potts into the picture, he would be committing himself to a process that would make it very difficult to give the consortium contract the attention it required during the negotiation period. Harlan Cobb had mentioned, with the careful pleasantness of a man delivering a veiled threat, that the consortium was also in talks with a rancher named Griffith from the south of the county, and that their patience for delay was limited. Dexter picked up the contract. He looked at it for a long moment, then he set it back down. "I need to ask you something, Harlan," he said. Harlan Cobb raised an eyebrow. He was a big man with a very still face. "I've got something I need to attend to before I can commit to this contract," Dexter said. "Something that concerns a neighbor and a piece of land that affects the water table I graze on. I'm asking for a 2-week extension on the response period." Harlan Cobb was quiet for a moment. "The contract offer is time-sensitive," he said. "I understand that," Dexter said, "and I respect your position, but I'm asking." Harlan looked at him for another long moment. "I cannot guarantee the offer will still be on the table in 2 weeks," he said. "I understand that too," Dexter said, and he stood up, put his hat on, and shook the man's hand. He rode back toward Caldwell with the late afternoon sun throwing long shadows across the grass, and he did not think about what he might have given up, because he had found, over 29 years of living, that the thing to do when you made a decision was to commit to it entirely and not spend your energy second-guessing it. He thought instead about the most efficient route to the Abbott place, and about what he was going to say when he got there, and about the fact that Ezra Potts was going to need to be convinced to testify, which would require the right approach and probably some of the good bourbon Dexter kept in the cabinet above his fireplace. He arrived at the Abbott place the following morning, just as the sun was an hour above the horizon. The house was modest but well kept, whitewashed with green shutters, and the yard was swept clean. The barn was in good repair and had clearly been recently painted on the south-facing wall. There was a kitchen garden along the east side of the house with late-season vegetables still in it, and a chicken coop, and beyond the fence, a pasture where a small herd of cattle grazed. Delia Abbott was in that pasture when he arrived. She was checking the fence line along the east edge, and she had a pair of pliers in her hand and a coil of wire over her shoulder, and she was moving with the purposeful efficiency of someone who had a long list of tasks and intended to complete all of them before dark. She was wearing a wide-brimmed hat against the morning sun, and when she turned to see who had ridden up her lane, There was a brief expression on her face that he could not quite read, something between surprise and assessment, before she settled into the careful neutrality that he recognized as the expression a person wore when they were not sure what to make of a situation. "Dexter Hartwell," she said. "Morning, Miss Abbott," he said and swung down from his chestnut. "I apologize for arriving unannounced. Do you have a few minutes?" She looked at him for a moment, then at the fence line, then back at him. "I have some," she said. He told her about Ezra Potts. He was direct about it because he had found that directness was almost always more respectful than preamble, and because he had a sense, watching her face as he talked, that she was the kind of woman who would not appreciate being talked around. He told her that Ezra had done the original survey, that Ezra knew where the original boundary stakes had been set, that Ezra could speak with legal authority at the hearing about why the second survey had diverged from the first, and that this testimony, properly presented, would substantially strengthen her case. Delia listened without interrupting. She was very good at listening, he noticed. She did not fidget or interject. She watched his face and processed what he was saying and waited until he was finished before she spoke. "How do you know all this?" she asked. He told her about the conversation 2 summers ago, about Ezra's habit of telling old survey stories to anyone who would listen, about the fact that Dexter had a good memory for the kind of detail that other people filed away as unimportant and then forgot. She was quiet for a moment. The morning wind moved through the buffalo grass beyond the fence. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. It was not an accusatory question. It was a genuine one. He considered the question honestly. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said. "And because the spring on your disputed parcel feeds water into the basin that more people than just you depend on, and I'd rather see it in your hands than in Drummond's." She looked at him for another moment. "And that's the whole of it?" she asked. "That's the whole of it," he said, and he met her gaze steadily, because it was the truth, or at least most of the truth. There was also the part where he had been thinking about her since the stockyard yard, but that was not something he was prepared to say out loud to a woman he had spoken to twice in his life, and whose kitchen garden he was currently standing beside. "All right," she said. "When can we talk to Ezra Potts?" "Today, if you want," he said. She pulled the coil of wire off her shoulder and hung it on the fence post nearest her. "Let me tell my hand where I'm going," she said. "Give me 10 minutes." Ezra Potts lived in a house that was small enough that the word modest felt generous. It was on the edge of Caldwell's southern district, a single-story structure with a porch so full of stacked items, old survey instruments, wooden crates, coils of chain and rope, a collection of glass bottles of varying sizes, that getting to the front door required navigating a path through them. Ezra himself was a man of 71 who had the slightly vague look of someone who lived primarily in the past, but whose eyes sharpened to remarkable precision whenever the conversation turned to surveying work. He remembered the Abbott survey with the clarity that certain people reserve for the work they did in their prime. 1863, he said, settling back in a chair that creaked profoundly under him. June. It was a wet June that year. I remember because the grass in the basin was higher than my knee and it made it harder to pace out the distances. Thomas Abbott was there. Good man, very particular about getting the boundaries right. He paused. "What's the trouble?" Delia told him. She laid it out clearly and without dramatics. The second survey, the discrepancy in the eastern boundary, the Drummond claim, the hearing date. Ezra listened with his eyes half closed, which Dexter had already learned was his focused listening expression rather than a sign of inattention. When Delia finished, Ezra was quiet for a moment. "The second survey used Garrison Creek as its eastern reference point," Ezra said. "That's wrong. I used the secondary benchmark, the carved stone out at the junction of the county road. The second surveyor either didn't know about the stone or didn't bother to look for it. The two reference points are about 30 yards apart, which is exactly where the discrepancy in your boundary would come from." He opened his eyes fully. "I still have my field notes from 1863. Delia looked at Dexter. He looked back at her. "Mr. Potts," she said, turning back to the old man, "would you be willing to testify at the hearing, to bring your field notes and explain the original survey methodology?" Ezra looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Dexter. "You vouching for this situation, Hartwell?" "I am," Dexter said. Ezra nodded slowly. "I don't get out much anymore," he said. "My bones don't like it, but I'll come. The boy there can drive me." He gestured at Dexter with a hand that had the gnarled look of someone who had spent decades outdoors. Thomas Abbott was a good man. His land should go to his daughter. Driving home that afternoon, with the hearing now 10 days away and their first genuine hope secured, Delia sat beside Dexter on the bench seat of his wagon and felt something loosen in her chest that had been clenched tight for 3 months. It was not relief exactly, because there was still the hearing itself, and Drummond's lawyer, and a county land commissioner who had a reputation for favoring larger operations. But it was something adjacent to relief. It was the feeling of not being entirely alone in this anymore. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You don't need to," he said. "We haven't won anything yet." "We," she said. He glanced sideways at her. "Figure of speech," he said. She looked at his profile for a moment against the open sky. "Is it?" she said. He was quiet for a beat. "Maybe not entirely," he said. They spent the next several days preparing for the hearing in a way that had the quality of a genuine partnership. Not because anyone arranged it that way, but because it became quickly evident that Dexter had a particular clarity for procedural logic and Delia had an encyclopedic knowledge of the actual land, the topography, the documented improvements, the years of tax payments, all the physical evidence that would corroborate Ezra's testimony about the original boundary. Dexter rode over to the Abbott place each morning. He told himself this was because the preparation work required it, which was true. He also could not entirely deny, as the days went on, that he was looking forward to those mornings with an enthusiasm that exceeded what pure civic duty could account for. Delia made coffee that was strong enough to do structural work, and she kept a tight and efficient household, and she had opinions about almost everything, delivered in a direct and considered way that Dexter found genuinely refreshing. She had read more than most people he knew, having had her father's library to draw from, and she had thought carefully about what she read, and she was not interested in agreement for its own sake. She disagreed with him twice in the first 3 days, once about the best approach to presenting the tax records, and once about whether Ezra needed to come in person or whether his written testimony would suffice, and both times she turned out to be right, and both times she did not press the point once it was settled, which he appreciated. On the 4th day, they rode out together to the disputed parcel so that Delia could show him the physical landmarks she intended to reference in her testimony. The old stone post that Ezra had described, which was still there, half buried in grass and mud, bearing the carved marking that matched Ezra's 1863 field notes exactly. The discovery of that stone, when Delia reached down and cleared the grass away from it with her bare hands, and there it was, solid and indisputable after 20 years, made her let out a long breath that had something of a laugh and something of a sob in it. Dexter was crouched beside her. He put his hand over hers on the stone for a moment without thinking about it, and then thought about it, and then left it there because she had not pulled away. "It was always here," she said. "The whole time." "It was always here," he agreed. She looked at him then, close enough that he could see the amber flecks in her dark eyes, and there was something in her expression that was open in a way he had not seen before in the careful weeks of preparation. Something that was not about the stone or the hearing or the land. "Why did you really come to me that morning?" she asked. "There are plenty of people in this county who know about Ezra Potts or who could have found out. Nobody came." He considered the question with the same honesty he had applied to everything else. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about what Pete mostly said," he answered. "And when I tried to figure out why I couldn't stop thinking about it, the most honest answer I could come up with was that the idea of you losing this place made me feel something I didn't want to feel." He paused. I've been thinking about you since that church social 3 years ago. I should have done something about it sooner than this." Delia looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon wind moved through the grass around them, and somewhere a meadowlark was singing 3 notes over and over. "That is a very inconvenient time to tell me that," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," she said, and she turned back to look at the stone, and she was almost smiling. "Just don't take another 3 years." He did not. He offered his hand when she stood up, and when she took it, he held on a moment longer than strictly necessary, and she let him. They rode back across the disputed parcel with the late afternoon throwing long shadows behind them, and for the first time in months, Delia felt the weight of the pending hearing as something she was facing toward rather than running from. 6 days before the hearing, Silas Drummond himself appeared at the Abbott place. Delia had not met him before. She had met his men and his lawyer, but Drummond was a man who sent representatives and rarely appeared himself except when he wanted to make an impression. He arrived on a very fine horse with 2 of his men behind him, a large man of about 55 with a silver-streaked beard, and the careful, self-contained bearing of someone who had spent decades being the most powerful person in every room he entered. Dexter was at the Abbott place when Drummond arrived. He had ridden over to go through the order of testimony they were planning, and he was at the kitchen table with his notes spread out when they heard horses in the yard. Drummond came to the front door and knocked, which was itself a kind of statement, the pretense of civility laid over the bones of a threat. Delia opened the door and looked at him and did not invite him in. "Miss Abbott," Drummond said, "I thought it was time we spoke directly." "We're speaking now," she said. Drummond glanced past her at Dexter, who was standing in the hall. Something shifted in Drummond's expression, a brief recalibration. He had expected her to be alone. "I want to make you a fair offer," Drummond said. "I know this process has been stressful. I know you're facing it without the kind of resources that make these things easier. What I'm proposing is a straightforward purchase of the disputed 80 acres at a rate above current market value. You would retain the rest of your property, you would have capital to improve your operation, and we could avoid what is likely to be an unpleasant experience at the hearing." Delia looked at him for a long moment. "The spring is on that parcel," she said. "I'm aware," he said. "Without the spring, the rest of the property drops substantially in value and viability," she said. "You know that, I know that. So what you're offering isn't actually fair. What you're offering is a choice between losing 80 acres at a price that sounds good and losing everything slowly." Drummond's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. "The hearing outcome is not certain," he said. "No," she said. "It isn't, but I have something to say at that hearing, and I intend to say it." She met his gaze steadily. "My father worked 20 years on this land. It's mine by law and by right, and I won't sell any part of it, especially not the part you're most interested in taking. Good day, Mr. Drummond." She closed the door. Dexter stood in the hall and looked at her for a moment. There was color in her cheeks and her hands were tightly clasped in front of her, the only visible indication of the effort it had taken to deliver that speech calmly. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. And then, after a pause, "That was the most frightening thing I have done in quite some time." "You didn't look frightened," he said. "I'm glad," she said. "I was shaking from the inside." He crossed the hall and did something he had not planned or rehearsed, which was to put both hands on her shoulders and look at her directly. "You were extraordinary," he said. "He came here to make you doubt yourself, and you didn't." She looked up at him, and the expression on her face was complicated in a way he wanted to spend a lot more time learning. "Having you here helped," she said quietly. "I don't think I would have answered the door quite the same way if I'd been alone." "You would have," he said. "You're more capable than you give yourself credit for." "You're more kind than I initially gave you credit for," she said. He wanted very much to kiss her then. He did not, because they had work to do and a hearing to win, and he was not a man who moved faster than the situation warranted. But he was aware of it as he stepped back, that want, warm and particular, entirely unlike anything casual. They spent the final days before the hearing in focused preparation. Dexter helped Delia rehearse her own testimony, walking her through the likely lines of questioning that Drummond's lawyer would pursue and helping her find clear and factual answers that could not be twisted. He organized Ezra's field notes into a presentation order that a land commissioner who was not a surveyor could follow. He drafted a written summary of the boundary discrepancy evidence that laid it out point by point in plain language. On the evening before the hearing, Dexter came by the Abbott place and found Delia sitting on the porch in the cooling air, looking out across her pasture where her cattle grazed in the long dusk light. He sat down beside her on the porch step, and they were quiet for a while in the way that people are quiet together when they have spent enough time in each other's company that silence has become comfortable. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, "I want you to know that what you've done here matters to me. Not just the help with the case, all of it, the way you've—" She paused, searching for words. "The way you've treated this like it was something worth taking seriously. Like I was someone worth taking seriously." "You shouldn't have had to say that," he said. "You are obviously someone worth taking seriously." "You'd be surprised," she said, with the small dry edge that he had come to recognize as the way she addressed things that had actually hurt her. 2 years of running this place alone, and most of the men in this county still look at me like they're waiting for me to give up so they can make a reasonable offer on the livestock." "They've underestimated you," he said. "They have," she agreed, without any satisfaction in it, just acknowledgement. He turned to look at her in the fading light. "I haven't," he said. "From that very first conversation at the church social, I went home that evening thinking I'd met someone remarkable." She looked back at him. In the dusk, her eyes were dark and steady. "Then why did you wait 3 years?" she asked, not accusatory, genuinely curious. He thought about it honestly. "Because I wasn't sure you'd want the complication," he said. 2 working ranchers in the same basin. It seemed like a lot to ask someone who was already managing a great deal. "Managing a great deal is what I do," she said. "A complication of that kind is something I could have decided for myself if you'd given me the chance." "I'm sorry I didn't," he said. "Stop apologizing for the past and do better going forward," she said, and the small, almost smile he loved was in the corner of her mouth. He leaned over and kissed her then on the cheek near the corner of her mouth, careful and deliberate, and he felt her breath catch and then steady. "Going forward," he said quietly. "Yes," she said, "going forward." They sat on that porch step until the dark came fully down, and the stars were thick above the Kansas grassland, and he did not leave until she went inside. And he rode home through the dark thinking about tomorrow with something that was not quite fear and not quite excitement, but somewhere between the two. That alive feeling of being about to find out something that mattered. The Sumner County Land Office hearing room was a long rectangular space in the county courthouse in Wellington, with wooden benches on both sides like a church, and a raised commissioner's bench at the front where Land Commissioner Amos Fletcher, a lean man of 60, with a precisely trimmed gray mustache and reading glasses that he wore on the very end of his nose, presided over a carved desk that was too large for the room. The place was more crowded than Delia had expected. She came in with Dexter beside her and Ezra Potts moving slowly on Dexter's other side, and she saw immediately that there were more observers than the proceedings strictly required. Word had gotten around, as it always did in Sumner County. The Abbott land dispute was known to most of the ranching community, partly because of its scope, and partly because people were interested in how a woman alone would handle Drummond's operation. Drummond was already seated with his lawyer, a man from Wichita named Prescott who had a reputation for aggressive procedural maneuvering. Prescott was well-dressed and composed, and gave Delia a single appraising look when she came in that managed to be perfectly polite on the surface, while communicating very clearly that he did not consider her a significant obstacle. Commissioner Fletcher called the hearing to order with a gavel that he used with precisely the right amount of authority. He read the formal statement of the matter. The question of whether the eastern boundary of the land originally filed by Thomas Abbott, under the Homestead Act of 1862 should be determined by the 1863 original survey or the 1880 resurvey, and what acreage properly fell within the Abbott claim. Prescott went first because Drummond was the filing party in the superior claim. He was, Delia had to admit, very good. He laid out the 1880 survey data with methodical clarity, presented the recorded measurements, cited the federal resurvey protocol that his client maintained the 1880 work had followed correctly, and brought in an affidavit from the 1880 surveyor, a man named Gilliam who was now living in Topeka, and had submitted a written statement rather than appearing in person. Prescott's argument was essentially that the 1880 survey was the more recent and properly recorded document and should therefore take precedence, and that the 80 acres in question fell clearly within that boundary as recorded. It was a clean, professional presentation. When he finished, Delia could feel the unease in the room, the sense that the weight of official documentation was sitting heavily on one side of the scale. Commissioner Fletcher looked at Delia over his glasses. "Miss Abbott," he said, "you may present your case." Delia stood. She had spent a week preparing this moment and she had rehearsed it until it was as natural as breathing. But she was also acutely aware that the room was watching her, that Drummond was watching her, that the outcome of the next hour would determine the shape of the rest of her life. She began with the history. Not the legal history, but the physical history. The clearing of the land, the planting of the first fields, the building of the barn, the digging of the irrigation channels that still ran from the headwater spring on the disputed parcel down to the main property. She described the 20 years of improvements her father had made, documented in the county tax records which she held up and which Dexter had organized into a clearly labeled packet. She described the 2 years she had run the operation since her father's death, the herd numbers, the maintenance, the ongoing investment in a property she had every legal right to occupy. Then she said, "I would like to call my witness, Mr. Ezra Potts." There was a brief rustle in the room. Prescott, who had been sitting in the relaxed posture of a man waiting for a formality to conclude, shifted slightly in his chair. Ezra came forward, moving slowly but with the kind of dignity that age can confer on people who have earned it, and he sat in the witness chair and identified himself for the record. Ezra Nathaniel Potts, former licensed surveyor for the Federal Land Office, employed in that capacity from 1859 to 1877. He described the 1863 Abbott survey in the deliberate, specific language of a man who had been precise by professional training for his entire working life. He described the reference points he had used, the methodology, the calculations. He described the benchmark stone at the county road junction and explained why it was the correct reference point for the eastern boundary, and why the Garrison Creek reference used by the 1880 surveyor introduced a measurement error of approximately 30 yards in a direction that shifted the apparent boundary to the disadvantage of the original filer. Then he opened his field notebook, a battered thing with a leather cover and pages brown with age, and he read from his own notes made on the day of the original survey in June of 1863, notes that gave exact measurements from the county road benchmark to each of the 4 boundary corners of the Abbott property. Commissioner Fletcher had put down his pen and was leaning forward with his elbows on his desk. Prescott objected to the field notes as documents not officially entered in the county record. Commissioner Fletcher listened to the objection, considered it, and ruled that original field notes from a licensed federal surveyor made at the time of the survey were admissible as primary documentation of the surveyor's intent and methodology. Prescott then cross-examined Ezra with the careful aggression of a man trying to find a crack in a foundation that had been well laid. He challenged Ezra's memory, his current competence, the age of the field notes, the possibility that the benchmark stone had been moved or was not original. Ezra answered each question with the patient precision of someone who had been interrogated by difficult men many times in his career, and had learned that the best response to aggression was simply the truth, delivered calmly. When Prescott suggested that the benchmark stone could not be verified as original since it had not been officially registered in the county surveying records, Delia stood. "Commissioner Fletcher," she said, "I'd like to enter an additional item of evidence." She placed on the commissioner's desk the photographs she had arranged to have taken the week before, hired a photographer from Wellington, photographs of the benchmark stone in situ, clearly showing the carved marking that matched Ezra's field notes exactly, along with a written measurement from the county road, consistent with the distance Ezra had recorded in 1863. She also placed beside them a copy of the county surveyor's general map from 1861, 2 years before the Abbott survey, which showed the county road junction benchmark as an established surveying reference point predating the Abbott filing by 2 years. The room was very quiet. Commissioner Fletcher took off his glasses and cleaned them, which seemed to be his way of giving himself a moment to think. He put them back on and looked at the photographs, and then at the 1861 map, and then at Ezra's field notes, and then at Prescott. "Counselor," he said, "what is your response to the benchmark stone evidence?" Prescott consulted with Drummond in a rapid, whispered exchange. "The Drummond Land and Cattle Company maintains that the 1880 survey represents the correct and current legal boundary," he said carefully. "The benchmark stone evidence does not in itself invalidate the 1880 survey." "The 1880 survey used the wrong reference point," Ezra said from the witness chair, simply and without particular emphasis, like a man stating that the sky was a particular color on a clear day. "I have laid out, in my original field notes, exactly why the Garrison Creek reference produces the error in the eastern boundary. Any qualified surveyor can verify the mathematics. The stone was always there. The fact that the 1880 surveyor did not use it does not change the property line that the original survey established." Commissioner Fletcher made a note on his papers. He made several notes. The room remained very quiet except for the scratch of his pen. He asked Delia several direct questions about the tax history, about the continuous occupation of the property, about the documented use of the headwater spring on the disputed parcel as part of the ongoing agricultural operation. She answered each one clearly and directly, and she felt, as she did, the remarkable steadiness that came from having prepared thoroughly and having the truth on her side. When Fletcher had finished his questions, he sat back and looked at both parties in turn. "This hearing will recess for 30 minutes, he said, "after which I will deliver my determination." The 30 minutes felt like a very long time. Delia sat in the front row of the benches with Dexter beside her and Ezra on the other side, and she held her hands folded in her lap and breathed slowly and did not look at Drummond or Prescott. Dexter did not say anything. He sat close enough that their arms were touching along the full length, and that contact, small and quiet, was enough. When Commissioner Fletcher returned, the room filled up fast, people crowding back in from the corridor. Fletcher sat down, put on his reading glasses, and looked at his notes for a moment that felt architectural in its weight. "In the matter of the Abbott homestead eastern boundary," he said, "having reviewed the original survey field notes of the licensed federal surveyor present at the 1863 filing, having examined the photographic evidence of the benchmark stone, consistent with said surveyor's methodology, having reviewed the county surveyor's general map of 1861, confirming the benchmark as an established reference point predating the original Abbott filing, and having considered the 20 years of tax and improvement records demonstrating continuous occupation and agricultural development of the full 460 acres, including the disputed parcel, this office finds in favor of the original 1863 survey boundaries as the legal and binding description of the Abbott homestead." He looked up from his notes. The eastern boundary of the Abbott property is established at the line consistent with the 1863 survey using the County Road Junction benchmark. The disputed 80 acres, including the headwater spring, fall within that boundary and are confirmed as Abbott property. The Drummond Land and Cattle Company's superior claim to said parcel is hereby denied. The room did not immediately erupt the way rooms do in stories, because people in a county courthouse in 1883 were generally more restrained than that. There was instead a kind of collective exhalation, a shift in the air, and then a murmur of conversation, and then from somewhere in the back, a single deliberate clap that was followed by several more. Delia sat very still for a moment. She was looking at Commissioner Fletcher's desk, at the papers and photographs and Ezra's field notebook laid out on it, and she was thinking about her father, about the June of 1863 when he had walked that land with a young surveyor, and pointed out the stone at the County Road Junction, and watched while the measurements were taken that would define everything that came after. About the 20 years he had spent making those 460 acres into something, about the 2 years she had spent not letting it become nothing. Dexter put his hand over her folded ones on her lap. She turned her head and looked at him. "It's yours," he said quietly. "It was always mine," she said, and her voice was steady even though her eyes were not entirely dry. "Yes," he said, "it was." Ezra Potts was gathering his field notebook with the careful movements of a man who had completed a job he had set himself to do. He looked over at Delia with the direct gaze of someone 20 years younger. "Your father would have been pleased," he said. "Thank you, Mr. Potts," she said. "More than I can say. Tell Hartwell he owes me a visit," Ezra said to her, as if Dexter were not sitting directly beside her, and there was something in the old man's expression that suggested he was not entirely unaware of what had been developing over the past 12 days. Drummond left without speaking to either of them, which was perhaps the most dignified option available to him. Prescott gathered his papers with efficient speed and followed. The rest of the room cleared gradually, and people came by to say things to Delia that were variations on congratulations. The ranchers who knew what the spring meant, the people who had watched this play out and were pleased by the outcome. Eventually it was just Delia and Dexter and Ezra in the hearing room, and then it was just Delia and Dexter because Ezra had gone ahead to wait in the wagon, and Delia stood in the middle of the empty room and took a very long breath. "I need to go home," she said. "I need to see it." "Then let's take Ezra back and go," he said. They drove Ezra back to his cluttered porch in the golden early afternoon, and Ezra went inside without ceremony, because he was not a man who prolonged goodbyes, and Delia and Dexter rode south through Caldwell and out onto the Basin Road. And the day was clear and bright, and the Kansas grassland stretched in every direction with the particular beauty it had in October when the summer heat had gone, and the grass had turned to gold and amber. They rode to the disputed parcel, what was now simply and completely the eastern 80 acres of the Abbott property, and Delia dismounted and walked out into the middle of it, into the long grass that moved around her like something breathing, and she stood beside the headwater spring where the cold water came up from below ground and ran away east in a thin, bright thread. She heard Dexter's boots in the grass behind her. "My father used to say this spring was why we stayed," she said. "After the bad years, when the wheat didn't come in and the cattle prices dropped, he used to bring me out here and say, 'As long as we have the spring, we have a reason to stay and work.' He meant it practically, the water table, the irrigation possibilities, but I always thought he meant it more than that." She paused. "Like the spring was the thing that made the land alive, the heart of it." Dexter stood beside her and looked at the water moving in its course. "I think he was right," he said. She turned to look at him. In the afternoon light, his face was open in a way that she had come to associate with the moments when he stopped managing his expression and simply let what he felt be visible. He was looking at her with an uncomplicated directness that made her feel seen in a way that was both wonderful and slightly terrifying. "I want to ask you something." he said. Then ask, she said. I gave up something to be here for this hearing, he said. Not because I want you to feel indebted about it, I want to be clear about that. But I want you to know I made the choice knowing what it cost, and I would make it again. She looked at him steadily. What did you give up? He told her about the consortium contract. All of it, the details, the significance, the conversation with Harlan Cobb, the extension that had probably lapsed by now. Delia listened to all of it without interrupting in the way she had, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Dexter Hartwell, she said, that was one of the most foolish things anyone has ever done on my behalf. I know, he said, and also, she said, one of the most extraordinary. Her voice had changed quality slightly, gone softer. You gave up the best grazing contract in the territory. Yes, he said simply. For me, she said, not a question. For you, he said, and for the right thing, both. She stepped toward him and she put her hand flat against his chest, over his heart, and she looked up at him with the afternoon sun behind her turning her hair to copper and amber. I am going to spend a very long time making sure that was worth it, she said. He put his hand over hers. Delia, he said, and that was all just her name, and she thought she had never heard her name said quite like that, with that particular weight and warmth. And she went up on her toes and kissed him properly for the first time, with the Kansas wind around them and the spring running beside them and the whole of the settled and secured land stretching away in every direction. It was not a tentative kiss. Neither of them had any inclination to be tentative. It was the kiss of two people who had spent 12 days coming to know each other in a crucible, and had arrived somewhere with complete certainty about where they wanted to be. When they stepped back from each other, slightly breathless, Dexter's smile was the widest she had seen from him, and it transformed his face entirely. I should have come to that church social with better intentions, he said. You should have, she agreed, and she was smiling too, the full, unreserved smile she kept for moments that genuinely merited it. The autumn settled in over the basin with the satisfying completeness of a season well earned. Delia spent the weeks after the hearing making the improvements she had been planning and deferring for years. She expanded the irrigation channel from the headwater spring, extending it to a second pasture section that had previously gone dry in the late summer months. She repaired the northern fence line that had been wanting attention since spring. She arranged to bring in a small additional lot of cattle before winter, carefully selected stock that would strengthen the overall herd quality. Dexter rode over most days, sometimes with a purpose, helping with the fence, assisting with the cattle sorting, bringing Ezra over to see the improvements and drink coffee in Delia's kitchen, while the old man told stories about survey work in the 1860s that were equal parts informative and entertaining. Sometimes without a specific purpose, simply because he wanted to be there, and because Delia, in the particular way of a woman who valued her independence and was also honest about her feelings, had made it clear she wanted him there. He sent a letter to Harlan Cobb at the consortium, explaining that he had not been available to respond within the contract period and acknowledging that the offer had likely lapsed. Cobb's reply surprised him. Evidently, the word of what had happened at the Abbott hearing had made its rounds in the ranching community, and Cobb, who was a businessman but not without a certain appreciation for a man who kept his commitments, had written to say that the consortium was prepared to extend a revised offer, somewhat less generous than the original but still substantially beneficial, to be considered at Dexter's convenience within the month. He showed the letter to Delia the evening he received it. She read it twice and then looked at him with something that was both relief and emotion. You didn't lose it, she said. Apparently not entirely, he said, though the revised terms are less favorable. Does it work, she asked, meaning financially. Yes, he said, it works. She handed the letter back to him. Then sign it, she said. You've earned it twice over. He signed it. The consortium contract went into effect on the 1st of November, 1883, and the combination of the guaranteed grazing income and the expansion plan he had been developing allowed Dexter to begin the process of acquiring an additional 60 acres adjacent to his north boundary, land that had come available when the owner relocated to Missouri. The Hartwell Ranch grew from 220 acres to 280, still modest by the territory's larger standards but well-positioned and well-run, the kind of operation that could sustain a family. He had been thinking about the word family with increasing frequency, and with a specificity he had not previously experienced. On an evening in late November, when the first hard frost had come, and the basin looked severe and beautiful in the way it only did in the cold months, Dexter came to the Abbott place in his good coat with his hat brushed, and sat at Delia's kitchen table with a cup of coffee that he did not drink, because he was too focused on what he was trying to say. Delia watched him manage his unusually uncertain composure with the patient amusement of a woman who was fairly certain she knew where this was going, and was content to let it arrive in its own time. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said finally, directly, because when he could not manage the preamble he defaulted to directness. "I have thought about it carefully. I want you to know that I'm not asking because of the land or the hearing or any of that. I'm asking because you are the most remarkable person I've met in my life, and I would like to spend the rest of it with you." Delia set down her own coffee cup. She looked at him for a moment, at the careful earnestness in his face, at the way he had gone still waiting for her answer, and she felt the warmth of it spread through her chest like the heat from the kitchen stove. "Dexter Hartwell," she said, "I have been waiting for you to get there for 3 weeks. Is that a yes?" he said. "Of course it's a yes," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and for a moment they just looked at each other in the warm lamplight of her kitchen, with the frost outside and the fire in the stove and the land outside the windows settled and secure, and it was one of those moments that does not need adornment. They were married in the spring of 1884, on a Saturday in April when the buffalo grass had come back green, and the wildflowers were showing along the creek banks. The ceremony was held at the county church in Caldwell, conducted by the minister who had been running services there for 15 years, and who performed the ceremony with a warmth that reflected genuine pleasure at the occasion. Ezra Potts came in his good suit, which appeared to have been in storage for some years but had been pressed with evident care. He sat in the front row and watched the proceedings with the focused attention of a man who has been asked to witness something important and takes the responsibility seriously. Most of the ranching community came, including people who had not expected to, drawn partly by the occasion and partly by the general feeling that there was something worth celebrating in two good people finding each other. Pete mostly came, and had the grace to look slightly abashed when he saw Delia, which was appropriate given his earlier prediction. Commissioner Fletcher came, which was a courtesy that Delia found genuinely touching. Even Harlan Cobb sent a letter of congratulation, which Dexter read aloud at the celebration afterward, and which was received with the warmth typically reserved for such gestures from men who are primarily businessmen making an effort. They did not attempt to combine the two properties into a single operation immediately. They were practical enough to recognize that what worked well separately needed to be adjusted thoughtfully when merged. They spent the first year of their marriage with Delia running the Abbott place and Dexter running the Hartwell Ranch, with the significant difference that they were now doing it together, making decisions jointly, sharing the labor on larger tasks, and riding the distance between the properties in the early mornings and evenings with a regularity that their neighbors found either romantic or excessive, depending on the neighbor. By the end of 1884, they had worked out a consolidation plan. The two properties were legally combined into the Hartwell Abbott Ranch, a name that Dexter proposed because he understood, with the clarity of a man paying attention, that Delia's name on that ranch was not a sentiment but a principle. The Abbott name had been on that land for 20 years, and it would remain. The combined operation was 680 acres, one of the more substantial holdings in the basin, and it was productive from the start because two competent ranchers working in coordination, are considerably more than twice as effective as one. They moved into the Abbott house, which was larger and better situated relative to the grazing land in the spring, and they made improvements over the first year that turned it from a house into a home in all the ways that distinction matters. Dexter built a proper study at the East End, because Delia read in the evenings and had outgrown the small bookcase in the bedroom and deserved a room with adequate shelving. She planted an expanded kitchen garden and a small orchard of apple trees that would not produce for 3 years, but that she planned for with the long view that characterizes people who are confident they will still be somewhere in 3 years. In the autumn of 1885, their first child was born, a boy they named Thomas Ezra Hartwell, Thomas for Delia's father and Ezra for the old surveyor who had kept the land in the family. He arrived on an October morning with the particular timing of babies who choose their own schedules, and he was a large, healthy child with Dexter's coloring and Delia's expression of focused assessment from the very first hours of his life. Ezra Potts came to see the baby 2 weeks after his birth and sat in the kitchen holding him with the careful competence of someone who had held many babies over a long life. "Good bones," he said, which was his highest form of compliment, delivered with the straightforward certainty of a man who had measured things precisely for 50 years and trusted his own judgment. He passed away the following spring, peacefully, at the age of 73, in his cluttered house at the edge of Caldwell. Delia and Dexter attended the small funeral, and Delia arranged to have the benchmark stone from the county road junction photographed and documented in the county surveyor's record, which Ezra had never gotten around to doing officially. It seemed like the right thing to do. A piece of history that had saved her family's land deserved to be properly remembered. The Hartwell Abbott Ranch grew steadily through the late 1880s. Dexter renewed the consortium contract twice on increasingly favorable terms, because his reputation and the quality of his breeding stock continued to earn him the standing that came with being known as a straight dealer who produced consistent results. Delia developed the agricultural side of the operation, expanding the crop acreage along the creek bottom where the spring-fed soil was particularly productive, and adding a small dairy operation that proved profitable in ways that surprised both of them initially. In 1887, their daughter was born. They named her Clara Jane, Clara for no reason except that it suited her from the first moment, and Jane for Delia's grandmother. She was a quieter baby than Thomas had been, watchful and attentive in the way of children who are processing everything around them before they comment on it. She grew into a child who spent long hours in her mother's study reading and her father's company on horseback with equal contentment. The basin changed around them in the late 1880s and into the 1890s. The railroad's expansion brought more settlers to Sumner County, and the wide open range that had characterized the early days of the territory grew more parceled and fenced as homesteaders arrived and established claims. Drummond's operation, it turned out, had overextended itself in ways that Drummond's confident manner had concealed, and by 1889 the Drummond Land and Cattle Company had contracted substantially, selling off several of its less productive parcels to meet debts. The basin saw the kind of change that comes when an era shifts, smaller operations becoming more viable as the large open-range model gave way to more intensive management. Dexter watched these changes with the thoughtful attention of a man who understood that adaptability was a form of competence. He and Delia talked through the implications over dinner and in the evenings on the porch, and on their early morning rides when the children were old enough to be left in the house, and they made adjustments that kept them well-positioned through each shift. They were not immune to the difficulties that came. A drought year in 1888 that required careful management of the water from the headwater spring. A winter in 1890 that cost them a portion of the herd despite every precaution. But they had built their operation on solid foundations, legally, physically, and in the quality of the decisions they made together, and the difficult years were years they came through rather than were broken by. Thomas grew up tall like his father and with his mother's precision of thought, and by the time he was old enough to begin learning the work of the ranch in earnest, he absorbed everything with the appetite of a child who sees a future in what he is being taught. He had an instinct for the cattle that was apparent early, a natural understanding of animal behavior that Delia recognized as the kind of competence that could not be taught, only developed. Dexter began taking him on longer rides to inspect the herd and the range when he was 7, and by 9, he was asking questions that required genuine consideration before answering. Clara, for her part, showed an inclination for the bookkeeping and planning side of the operation that delighted Delia in a way she did not fully articulate because she did not want to project expectations onto her daughter. But watching Clara at the kitchen table with the ranch ledgers, adding columns with the methodical focus of someone who found order satisfying rather than tedious, was deeply gratifying in the private way of a woman who had kept those ledgers alone for 2 years and understood what it meant to be capable of doing it. On an evening in the autumn of 1892, 9 years after the land hearing that had changed everything, Delia and Dexter sat on the porch of the Abbott house, their house now, and watched Thomas and Clara play in the yard in the last of the October light. Thomas was 8 and Clara was 5, and they were conducting some kind of elaborate game with the stakes and string setup that Thomas had constructed near the chicken coop, the purpose of which neither parent could quite determine, but which both children took very seriously. The headwater spring ran its steady cold thread east from the far pasture, as it always had. The cattle were settled in the south pasture for the evening. The barn was in good repair, recently painted by Dexter and Thomas working together over 2 weekends in September. The orchard, now 8 years old, had produced its best apple crop of the season just 2 weeks before, and there were jars of preserved apples in the cellar that would last through February. "Do you remember," Dexter said, "the morning I came to your fence line with what I thought was important information about an old surveyor?" "I remember being skeptical," Delia said. "You were extremely skeptical," he agreed. "Your face was very polite, but your eyes were skeptical." She laughed. It was one of the things he still found profoundly good, her laugh, which she gave without reservation when something merited it. "I had had a difficult few months," she said. "You had," he said. "And then you solved the problem with more thoroughness and capability than anyone else in that courtroom, including the people who had been doing it professionally." "We solved it," she said. "You mostly," he said, because he believed in accuracy. She leaned her head against his shoulder in the easy way of years of closeness. "You gave up the best grazing contract in the territory," she said. "And got it back," he said. "And got it back," she said. "But you didn't know that when you made the choice." "No," he said. "I didn't." She was quiet for a moment, watching Clara successfully instruct Thomas on whatever the game required, with the bossy authority of a younger sibling who has identified a domain in which they are more competent than their elder. "I've thought about that sometimes," she said. "What it cost you to make that choice, what it said about you." "It said I was somewhat impulsive," he said. "It said you were a good man," she said quietly. "The kind worth keeping." He turned and kissed her temple, the easy, intimate gesture of a man who has made 1,000 such gestures over 9 years and still means every one of them. "I feel the same about you," he said, "for whatever it's worth." "It's worth everything," she said. Thomas had constructed something with the string that appeared to be a survey line, and he was pacing distances with 7-year-old earnestness, and Clara was marking the endpoints with small stones. Delia watched this for a moment and then felt something warm move through her, a recognition that was also a kind of completion. "He's going to be a good rancher," she said. "He's already a good one," Dexter said. "He just hasn't grown into the responsibility yet." "Clara's going to run the books," Delia said. "She already runs them better than I do," Dexter said. "She runs them better than I do," Delia said, which was generous and probably true. The October evening was settling into the cool that presaged a clear night, and the first stars were appearing in the east above the long line of the horizon. The grass in the pastures moved in the light wind, that perpetual motion that Delia had watched her entire life, the breathing of the land that had been her father's and was hers and was now theirs and would be her children's. She had been the last Abbott left on 460 acres, and she had almost lost it, and she had not. She had stood in a county hearing room and told the truth with evidence behind it, and she had kept what was hers. She had found in the process a man who had chosen her before she knew he was choosing, who had given up something significant without making a transaction of it, who had sat beside her through 12 difficult days of preparation, and on a porch step in the dark, and at the kitchen table over coffee, and on the disputed parcel beside a headwater spring, and had been consistently, genuinely himself. She had built something with him. They had built something. It was still standing and would go on standing, she was confident, because it was built on the right things. "I want another baby," she said. Dexter was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. He took her hand. She turned to look at him, and he was looking at her with the expression she knew best from him, the one that was open and certain and without reservation. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. "Delia," he said, "there is nothing you could propose in this direction that I would not agree to." She laughed again, that full, real laugh. "Don't say that without conditions," she said. "I might take advantage." "I'm counting on it," he said. Thomas looked up from his surveying project and saw his parents laughing on the porch, and rolled his eyes with the magnificent exasperation of an 8-year-old who suspects adults are laughing at something he should not find funny, then returned to his measurements. Clara added another stone with solemn precision. The night came down fully over the basin, and the stars spread thick and brilliant above the Kansas grassland, and the headwater spring ran on in the dark, cold and steady, the heart of the land doing what it had always done. The Abbott house, the Hartwell Abbott house, glowed with lamplight through its windows. The orchard trees stood in their dark rows. The cattle settled for the night in their pastures. Everything was as it should be. Everything was, in the particular way that luck and work and love produce when they align, exactly right. In the summer of 1893, their second son was born. They named him Daniel, for no more complicated reason than that it suited him, and he arrived in July with the enthusiastic energy of a warm season and the considerable lungs of a child who had things to say from the beginning. Thomas was fascinated by him with the intensity of a child who has received a gift he was not sure he wanted, and then discovers he wants it very much. Clara regarded him with the measured assessment of someone taking the long view. Delia held Daniel on the afternoon of his 3rd day in the world, and sat by the window of their bedroom where the afternoon light came in clean and warm, and she could see the eastern pasture through the glass, the long grass and the line of the creek, and the far shimmer of the headwater spring. Dexter sat on the edge of the bed beside her with his hand on Daniel's small back, and Thomas was in the doorway being appropriately quiet in the way he had been told to be, and Clara was leaning against Delia's knee looking at the baby with an expression that was both 3 years old and somehow ageless. "He looks like a Daniel," Thomas said eventually, abandoning restraint in favor of commentary. "He is a Daniel," Dexter said. "Will he learn to survey?" Thomas asked, because surveying had become his private fascination, a legacy of watching his mother's description of the boundary stone and old Ezra's field notes. "He'll learn whatever he wants to," Delia said. "He'll want to learn surveying," Thomas said with the confidence of someone who has decided this is true and expects the world to comply. "Give him a few years," Dexter said. Thomas accepted this as a reasonable position and retreated to the kitchen, where the sounds of him investigating the cold larder shortly afterward confirmed that the solemnity of the occasion had concluded to his satisfaction. Clara stayed a while longer, her small hand resting on the blanket near Daniel's feet, and Delia watched her daughter's face with the quiet wonder of a mother who sees something forming that will take decades to fully know. Outside the window, the basin lay in the full abundance of a good July. The grass was deep and green from a sufficient spring. The creek ran clear. The apple trees in the orchard were bearing their first real crop, 7 years after planting, the fruit still small and green but there, definitive and promising. Dexter caught Delia watching the window and looked out with her. "Good year," he said. "Good year," she said. "Good life," he said. She looked at him then over the head of their sleeping youngest child, with full and uncalculating feeling. "The best," she said. "The very best." And the land stretched away from them in every direction, 460 acres of buffalo grass and hard soil and cold spring water, Abbott land and Hartwell land and family land, settled and certain, theirs.